Just when you think the map is settled, someone in Washington reaches for a knife and starts talking about dinner plans. This isn't hyperbole, and it isn't cable news theatrics. A former Canadian ambassador, someone who spent years inside the diplomatic machinery, has just said the quiet part out loud. After what the United States did in Venezuela, Canada should assume it's on the menu too, not hypothetically, not someday, now. Bob Ray didn't say this to stir panic. He said it because for the first time in generations, the rules that kept borders boring and sovereignty dull have been tossed aside. And once that happens, once a superpower decides legality is optional, everyone nearby has a problem, especially the neighbors sitting on oil, water, minerals, and Arctic access. Let's start with what actually happened, because details matter, and this didn't unfold by accident. In the early hours of January 3rd, 2026, Caracas woke up to explosions. By the time the sun came up, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife were in U.S. custody. The Trump administration called it decisive, supporters called it strength. But within 3 days, the real motive was laid bare. Washington announced that Venezuela would be handing over between 30 and 50 million barrels of oil to the United States. At roughly $56 a barrel, that's a transaction worth close to $3 billion. And here's the part that should make any international lawyer sit up straight. U.S. officials didn't describe this as a temporary arrangement. They said they would control Venezuelan oil sales indefinitely. Indefinitely. That word does a lot of work. This wasn't framed as aid. It wasn't restitution. It wasn't even a short-term stabilization plan. It was resource control, openly stated, unapologetically claimed, and almost immediately the rhetoric followed the action. On January 6th, Trump's deputy chief of staff, Stephen Miller, went on national television and declared that the future of the free world depends on America asserting its interests without apology. The State Department followed up with a social media message that stripped away any remaining ambiguity. This is our hemisphere, not shared, not cooperative, ours. For Bob Ray, who had just finished 5 years representing Canada at the United Nations, the message couldn't have been clearer. He told Canadian media that the United States under Trump has abandoned multilateralism entirely, replacing it with raw dominance. And then he delivered the line that landed like a thunderclap: Canada is on the menu. If you think otherwise just because no one has said 51st state out loud, he warned, you're missing what this administration is actually about. This isn't coming out of nowhere. Trump's new national security strategy explicitly calls for reviving and modernizing the Monroe Doctrine, the 19th century policy that justified American intervention across Latin America for over 100 years. Pair that with recent threats directed at Greenland, Colombia, and Cuba, and what emerges isn't chaos, it's doctrine, a worldview where sovereignty exists only at Washington's discretion. Think about the precedent being set. A sovereign government is removed by foreign troops. Its head of state is seized, its primary national resource is claimed and managed by another country. No international court, no UN authorization, no meaningful legal process. If that's acceptable now, then what exactly protects any country in the hemisphere? The irony is almost painful. The United States helped write the UN Charter after World War II, embedding the principle that military force cannot be used to overthrow governments. For decades, Washington positioned itself as the enforcer of those rules, condemning Russia in Ukraine, warning China over Taiwan, and yet, when it came to Venezuela, those principles were simply discarded. At an emergency UN Security Council meeting on January 5th, even U.S. allies expressed alarm. Venezuela's UN envoy called for unequivocal condemnation of the use of force. Behind closed doors, diplomats from NATO countries voiced concern about the damage this does to the international order. Publicly, most stayed quiet. One diplomat described the White House as volatile, and no one wanted to poke it. But silence doesn't erase consequences. The strategic justification offered by Washington leans heavily on security language. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the U.S. will not allow the Western Hemisphere to be used as a base for adversaries. Notice what's missing there. There's no talk of partnerships, no reference to international cooperation, just control. And then there's the economics, which may be the real driver. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, around 300 billion barrels. Even partial access to that kind of supply is a financial windfall. The initial 30 to 50 million barrel transfer looks less like an endpoint and more like a down payment. U.S. officials have made clear that Washington will oversee Venezuelan oil revenues going forward. Call it what it is. That's not regime change. That's appropriation. Now shift your gaze north. Canada is the world's fourth largest oil producer, sending about 4 million barrels a day to the United States. Roughly 97% of Canadian oil exports flow south. Canada also controls about 7% of the world's renewable freshwater supply. It sits on enormous deposits of lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements, materials essential for modern technology and defense systems. And it holds vast Arctic territory that's becoming more valuable by the year as ice melts and new shipping routes open. If resource security is the metric, Canada isn't just relevant, it's irresistible. Fenn Osler Hampson, a respected international affairs scholar in Ottawa, put it bluntly, Canada risks being downgraded from a sovereign neighbor to a junior resource appendage, not a partner, a supplier, and not by choice. He warns that pressure won't be limited to oil. Anything Washington deems vital to national security, water, minerals, infrastructure, could be brought into play. History offers a familiar warning. In 1989, the United States invaded Panama to capture Manuel Noriega. The operation was widely condemned, including by some U.S. allies. But it followed a recognizable pattern: identify a problematic leader, justify intervention, reap strategic benefits. The Venezuela operation echoes that template, with oil playing the starring role. The logic chain is disturbingly clean. Energy priorities create incentives. Massive reserves present temptation. Military force removes obstacles. Resource control follows. And once that happens successfully, a precedent is born. Here, imagine a neighborhood where everyone agrees to respect property lines. Then the biggest house on the block kicks in a door, removes the occupants, and announces it's managing the property now, indefinitely, because it's in everyone's best interest. You wouldn't sleep easily after that. Neither does Canada. Ray has been especially critical of Canada's muted response. He warns against the fantasy that staying quiet will keep the country off Washington's radar. Hoping not to be noticed, he says, is not a strategy. It's an invitation. Canadians, he argues, need to be told plainly that their sovereignty is being tested, and pretending otherwise only weakens their position. What's emerging is a legal vacuum. As multilateral rules erode, the world drifts toward spheres of influence dominated by major powers. The US, Russia, and China each claim their zones. Middle powers like Canada get squeezed. In that kind of system, law matters less than leverage, and silence is read as consent. The fallout isn't confined to diplomats and professors. Ordinary Americans have skin in this too. When the United States normalizes military action to seize resources, it weakens the legal protections that American companies rely on abroad. If Washington can do this in Venezuela, other countries can cite the same logic to justify seizing U.S. assets. American firms operate oil fields, mines, and factories across Latin America, Africa, and Asia worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Those investments are suddenly riskier. And then there's the domestic energy impact. 30 to 50 million barrels sounds dramatic, but it's only about a week of U.S. consumption. The real effect comes if Venezuelan production ramps up long term. Increased supply pushes prices down, good for drivers, disastrous for oil workers in Texas and North Dakota who need higher prices to stay employed. For Canadians, the threat is more immediate. The oil sector directly employs around 170,000 people, with hundreds of thousands more in supporting industries. After Trump's Venezuelan announcement, Canadian heavy crude prices dropped by a few dollars per barrel. If that dip holds, it translates into hundreds of millions in lost revenue. Mining executives are watching just as nervously. Canada's critical mineral projects attracted investment because they were considered politically safe. Now, those long-term plans have to factor in a kind of political risk that simply didn't exist before. And that's where we'll stop for now, because what comes next is where the economic shockwaves hit everyday life. Small businesses, border communities, and global alliances in ways most people haven't fully grasped yet. Those shockwaves don't announce themselves with explosions or headlines. They creep in quietly through balance sheets, hiring freezes, canceled orders, and decisions that never get made. The first people to feel it aren't presidents or ambassadors. They're small manufacturers, logistics operators, tourism workers, and families who depend on a border that used to feel permanent. Take the communities that sit directly on the US-Canada line, places like Windsor, Ontario, staring across the river at Detroit. Hundreds of small factories there produce components for American auto plants, brackets, sensors, wiring assemblies. Most of these businesses employ a few dozen workers at most. Their margins are thin, often under 10%. They survive on predictability, stable trade rules, clear contracts, a shared understanding that tomorrow will look roughly like today. That assumption is cracking. When the United States demonstrates it's willing to ignore international agreements when they become inconvenient, every cross-border business has to reprice risk overnight. 5-year expansion plans suddenly feel reckless. New machinery purchases get delayed, hiring pauses, not because demand vanished, but because trust did. Tourism tells a similar story. Travel between the US and Canada is a $20 billion industry. Airlines, hotels, tour operators, restaurants, entire local economies depend on the idea that the border is boring. Over the past weeks, operators on both sides have reported noticeable drops in advance bookings for the summer season. Estimates put the decline between 8 and 12% compared to last year. That may not sound catastrophic, but in an industry built on volume, it's enough to tip profitability into loss. Large corporations are reacting too, just more quietly. Energy and mining firms with assets in both countries have started delaying investment decisions. Executives don't like uncertainty, and what the Venezuela operation introduced is a new category of it. Political risk inside North America was once considered negligible. Now it's a line item. Markets have noticed. Since early January, Canadian energy stocks have underperformed the broader market by several percentage points. That gap represents billions in lost market value, not because oil disappeared, but because confidence did. Investors are pricing in the possibility that access, pricing, or ownership rules could change under political pressure, and the world is watching. European officials have been unusually candid about their discomfort. Publicly, they speak in careful language. Privately, the concern is sharper. The seizure of Venezuela's president and the appropriation of its oil revenue undercut the moral argument the West has relied on when condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Sovereignty isn't supposed to be conditional. Once it becomes optional, every justification starts to sound hollow. Russian officials have already seized on the contradiction, arguing that if Washington can act within its hemisphere, Moscow can do the same in its neighborhood. Chinese diplomats make parallel arguments regarding Taiwan. The precedent doesn't stay local, it globalizes. The post-World War II order, for all its flaws, rested on a simple bargain. Major powers would restrain themselves because everyone benefited from predictable rules. That system prevented direct conflict between great powers for 80 years. What the Venezuela operation signals is that restraint is now negotiable. Bob Ray has been relentless on this point. Undermining international law, he argues, leaves democracies unable to defend it elsewhere. You can't insist on sovereignty for Ukraine or Taiwan while violating it in your own backyard. The argument collapses under its own weight. Experts across the spectrum echo that concern. Fen Osler Hampson doesn't sugarcoat his assessment. He says Canada should assume it will be under intense pressure from Washington going forward. Pressure to align fully with U.S. policy toward China. Pressure to scrutinize foreign investment in Canadian resources. Pressure to treat national assets as continental ones. Whether Canadians like it or not, he warns, the leverage now runs overwhelmingly south. The only protection, in his view, is collective action, middle powers acting together. Because in a world carved into spheres of influence, countries like Canada don't get vetoes. They get choices between bad options. Legally, the situation is just as grim. There is no credible argument that the Venezuela operation fits within the UN Charter. The prohibition on using force to change governments is explicit. Legal scholars across multiple countries have called the action a clear violation of international law. What makes it more dangerous is normalization. Once something unprecedented happens without consequence, it becomes available for reuse. That's what international law professors mean when they talk about permissive normalization. Behavior that was once unthinkable becomes arguable, then acceptable, then routine. Inside Canada, political reaction has been cautious to the point of silence. Prime Minister Mark Carney welcomed Maduro's removal, but avoided criticizing how it was achieved. According to foreign policy analysts, that restraint reflects fear. Fear of antagonizing a White House known for retaliating unpredictably, especially with high stakes trade negotiations looming. Canada faces sensitive talks this summer over renewing the North American trade framework. Officials worry that open criticism could poison those negotiations before they begin, but Ray calls that logic dangerously short sighted. Staying quiet, he argues, doesn't buy safety, it buys time and not much of it. He insists Canadians need an honest conversation now about what sovereignty actually means in this new environment, not as an abstract principle, but as a practical reality. Can a country remain independent if its most valuable resources are considered fair game by a more powerful neighbor? In the near term, over the next 1 to 3 months, don't expect dramatic public confrontations. Canadian leaders are likely to tread carefully until trade talks are clearer. Behind the scenes, though, there are signs of movement. European governments have begun discussing closer coordination with Canada and other middle powers to defend core legal principles. The idea is simple. Alone, they're vulnerable. Together, they might matter. Looking 6 to 12 months ahead, two paths emerge. In the first, Washington makes explicit demands, not necessarily tanks at the border, but pressure, expanded access to energy, preferential rights to water, restrictions on how Canada manages its critical minerals. In that scenario, Canada faces a stark choice: comply quietly or resist publicly and rally international support. Ray argues resistance is the only way to preserve sovereignty, but it only works if alliances are built in advance. The second path is broader and darker. Other powers follow the Venezuelan example. Regional interventions multiply, each justified by security, history, or necessity. The rules erode further. Conflict becomes more likely, not less. The stability that underwrote global growth since 1945 starts to fracture. Strip away the jargon, and three realities remain. First, the Venezuela operation wasn't an isolated act. It established a working model. Military force can be used to secure resources in the Western Hemisphere without legal restraint. Second, Canada's resource profile, energy, minerals, water, Arctic access, makes it an obvious focus under that model. Third, political silence is not neutrality. In moments like this, it's a gamble, and history suggests it's usually a losing one. What's unfolding isn't just a foreign policy shift, it's a redefinition of sovereignty itself. Borders still exist on maps, but their meaning is changing. Power is being reasserted in ways most people alive today have never experienced. The consequences won't all arrive at once. They'll show up in lost jobs, higher risks, strained alliances, and a world that feels less predictable every year. Whether this trajectory hardens or reverses depends on choices being made right now, quietly, behind closed doors, and sometimes in public silence. Because once the idea takes hold that some countries are merely resource pools attached to stronger neighbors, it doesn't stop with one operation. It spreads. And when it does, everyone, Americans included, ends up living in a more dangerous world.